You're listening to an ECGI podcast on corporate power and the politics of change with Matteo Gatti.
Corporate America spent a decade becoming an activist. It took sides on guns, climate, race, voting rights. It embedded social commitments into governance structures, compensation packages, and proxy statements. And some of it worked. Corporations helped drive the partial repeal of North Carolina's bathroom bill. Corporate pressure helped #MeToo produce actual legal change. Mandatory arbitration for sexual harassment claims was eventually banned by Congress. Nike's bet on Colin Kaepernick changed the cultural conversation on race and policing, and it made the company billions. Juneteenth became a corporate holiday before it became a federal one. None of that was nothing. Then, after the 2024 election, it stopped fast, or it seems to stop fast. And the reversal looked nothing like the advance. It was abrupt, uncoordinated, and in many cases, poorly thought through. The two scholars I have with me today have spent years making the affirmative case for corporate activism. I've spent years identifying its risks. I want to revisit that conversation, not to settle scores, but because the retreat, more than the advance, may be where the real lessons live. I'm Matteo Gatti. This is Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. Stay with us. Welcome to Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. I'm Matteo Gatti, professor of law at Rutgers Law School, research member of ECGI, and the author of Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, published by Cambridge University Press. The book's argument is that over the last decade, corporations stepped into spaces that governments had abandoned or were never going to enter. Climate, race, guns, reproductive rights. I call this corporate governing. It is a response to political paralysis. And in my book, I document both what it has achieved and the institutional and democratic risks it creates when corporations become the default vehicle for issues that democratic politics has failed to resolve. What we witnessed since is a near total reversal. BlackRock's retreat, Meta's reversal, the mass scrubbing of DEI commitments after the 2024 election. The reversal was fast, reactive, and in many cases done in ways that created new legal and governance problems that companies hadn't anticipated. My two guests today have been among the most rigorous voices making the affirmative case. Tom Lin is professor of law at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. His book, The Capitalist and the Activist, Corporate Social Activism and the New Business of Change, is the most thorough account we have on how corporations and activists have learned and are still learning to work together. Tom documents carefully both the promise and the peril of that relationship. Aneil Kovvali is associate professor of law at Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. His article, Stark Choices for Corporate Reform, argues that voluntary corporate action on behalf of stakeholders and external regulations are complements, not substitutes. That pursuing one does not crowd out the other, and that corporate initiatives can help create the conditions for broader regulatory change. He also has a new project we'll hear about called Corporate Resistance. Tom, Aneil, thank you both for being here. I want to start with the retreat from corporate engagement. And in fact, I want to start with what came before it. Tom, my book cites yours. Corporate governing, as I call it, at its best, produced real change. The #MeToo arbitration reform, North Carolina's HB2, the Juneteenth federal holiday, Nike and Kaepernick, these were not nothing. What made those work and what distinguishes them from the commitments that reversed when the political wind shifted?
Well, Matteo, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I think those cases work in part because there was a good alignment of business actions and business values with the social political priorities of the moment. Businesses don't exist in a vacuum. They ultimately have to reflect the priorities and pressures of the moment within the communities in which they operate in. We've seen some repositioning of some of those actions from a few years ago, but I think it's probably too early to say whether that repositioning is a categorical or permanent reversal.
Okay, thank you. We'll get into that as we move along. Aneil, Stark Choices documents something I also acknowledge in the book, that internal corporate initiative and external regulation have in many cases moved on parallel tracks rather than trading off against each other. Corporate action on mandatory arbitration helped produce congressional action. Corporate recognition of Juneteenth helped produce a federal holiday. The sequencing you describe, corporations acting first, legislators following, proved to be real at times. Yet, at the same time, Your corporate resistance project also documents corporate America's capitulation during the second Trump administration. Where did the sequencing from stark choices break down? What went wrong between the model your article describes and what we saw after 2024?
Thank you for having me. I think there's been a lot of change across different dimensions in corporate America. You can break it down into two basic categories. One has been changes in the external environment, so things that are happening outside of corporations. And corporate resistance kind of breaks it down into two different ways. We can think of the environment that we saw during the Stark Choices period as being one in which the government was relatively inactive or unable to pursue a wide variety of popular initiatives. And in that kind of environment, a business looking around might say, well, there are things that people really support that the government isn't doing. So we have a commercial value in pursuing that. We can strengthen our relationship with customers, with our employees by pursuing these initiatives. And on the other hand, we're not too worried about the government coming after us. It's because it's mostly the main reason that the government hasn't done something is paralysis as opposed to active opposition. And that's one kind of external environment and one in which ESG and corporate social responsibility can really flourish. The second Trump administration is a really different environment. We're not seeing the government unable to act on popular initiatives. We see the government very energetically pursuing a very particular agenda. And that's an environment in which corporate America might look around at the environment and say, you know what? If we pursue these initiatives, then we're making ourselves a target of the government. We're going to pay a major cost. And if they're looking for benefits, they might say the benefits aren't there anymore. The workers who had seemed so empowered during earlier periods now seem quite chastened. Customers don't seem as engaged on these issues as before. So those are the external drivers, I think, of a significant change. There have also been some internal drivers or things going on within corporations. I'm kind of put it into two different categories there. One might be simple agency problems. Corporate leaders aren't necessarily doing the right thing for their shareholders. If you're a shareholder and you're diversified across a whole bunch of different companies, you might have one set of priorities on, say, climate change or the rule of law. Whereas if you are a concentrated holder, or if your entire human capital is invested in one corporation, like the CEO of a company might be, then you have a very different set of priorities, right? So a person who's diversified wants companies to fight, to resist unlawful action. A company or a CEO who's very concentrated interest in one company might prefer something different, right? So think about Tim Cook, for example. The average Apple shareholder might want the company to push back against unlawful tariffs. Tim Cook might prefer to just strike a deal to get himself and his company out of the tariffs. That's better for Apple and better for his personal portfolio, but not for the diversified portfolio. A final sort of category on the internal front might be simple incompetence or miscalculation. And I think there's a lot of that across various domains in the United States right now. People looked at the 2024 election and misread or potentially overread the results of that election. People look at Donald Trump's success in being reelected to the presidency and think of that as meaning that America embraces everything that Donald Trump is about, as opposed to simply being disgusted by inflation or just angry about the long recovery from COVID. Every incumbent party across the industrialized world suffered similar kinds of problems in that 2024 period. So it would be a mistake, and it has been a mistake, to sort of read the 2024 election as meaning that America has shifted in a profoundly regressive or conservative direction. And yet that's the choice, that's the reading that a lot of corporate America has selected. And because of that, they've sort of gone out and pursued that sort of conservative approach, and oftentimes have alienated their customers and employees in the process. Target is a really excellent example of that. They said, okay, I guess America doesn't want equality anymore. We're going to back away from our prior commitments, our prior identity. And the reaction, of course, of our customers was, okay, well, we're no longer interested in shopping at Target. And so there's that dimension of miscalculation as well.
Great. So this sets this perfect stage for what I wanted to go over, which is the retreat itself. I want to spend some time because, as you said, I think it's probably been misread both by people who see it as a complete vindication of the skeptics of this whole phenomenon of corporate activism, and also by the people who see it as a temporary overcorrection. So in my book, I argue that, yes, corporate governing is structurally fragile. It depends on, as you said, configuration of competitive conditions, investor pressure, stakeholder expectations that maybe wasn't never guaranteed to hold constantly all the time the same conditions. And so what we saw after the 2024 election is just corporations responding to political pressure. It was corporations revealing in the speed and in some ways in their disorganization that many of the commitments have been shallower than they appeared. But I want to add an extra point, which is the reversal wasn't strategic, in fact. It wasn't a careful governance decision. In many cases, it was panic itself, right? Companies started to scrub DEI language from their filings and documents in ways that created new disclosure risks. They abandoned programs without assessing what they owed the recipients of these programs, the employees and investors who had been told that these were core commitments of the corporations. Lisa Fairfax and Veronica Ruth Martinez have written about this, and the retreat may turn out to be a worse governance failure than the advance. And we had Veronica on the podcast a few weeks ago here. Tom, does all of this ring true to you? And what does the speed of the reversal tell us about what corporations were actually doing in the first place?
I think businesses and business executives are incredibly attentive, sensitive, and responsive to changes in the marketplace, the regulatory environment, and politics. And as a result of that, they're going to reposition their policies. They're going to sort of rebrand their previous commitments. And I think it's difficult to say categorically with a broad brush that corporate America has done X, because I think there are a lot of companies doing a lot of different things. Part of what has made American businesses so successful relative to firms elsewhere is that they are incredibly fast at adapting to changes in the marketplace and changes in the regulatory environment. And I think in this day and age where change is happening at an accelerated velocity, not surprisingly, you're seeing businesses respond in a really fast way. And some of the responses might not be as thoughtful as we would like it to be, but they are simply trying to manage their business in a dynamic marketplace. I would also add that it's really too early to tell whether the repositioning of certain policies is permanent or lasting. I think one of the really nice things and also one of the really frustrating things about living in a democratic society with a capitalist marketplace is that there are really no permanent victories or permanent losses. The good ideas, the winning ideas of today could easily become the losing ideas of tomorrow and vice versa.
That's a great reminder. Thank you. Also like a good way to look at this with an optimistic eye. Aneil, your paper Start Choice argue is that the political forces blocking external reform couldn't easily redirect to block internal corporate reform. At least that was what you were writing at the time, and interesting to see how things have changed. But corporations had a degree of insulation from the same political dynamics that froze legislators. The last 2 years suggest that these forces found a way. Republican state AGs, executive orders, weaponization of regulatory threat. We had Mark Rowe on the podcast talking about this precisely. So how do you assess these somewhat changed conditions now?
Yeah, so I guess I would start by acknowledging that I am somewhat more pessimistic now than when I wrote the Start Choices paper. But at the same time, I do want to distinguish between a couple of things. So first, we might distinguish between sort of governmental inaction and then government acting in a sort of aggressive or disfavored sort of way. Right. So if the government is unable to act because there's a lack of consensus or because there's a process issue or separation of powers, then that might be a reason why we don't see government action, but it doesn't prevent corporations from acting in a particular way. Right. So there are plenty of reasons why, say, Joe Biden or Barack Obama couldn't have achieved a particular policy objective. The courts or Congress wouldn't go along with their preferences. Those things would not necessarily have held up corporations pursuing those goals. And so that is a fundamentally different dynamic from one in which the government is vigorously pursuing a particular policy agenda, and then we're asking companies to sort of push in the opposite direction. Another sort of thing that might be worth thinking about, though, is that it's not always obvious that these are changes in corporate behavior in response to the government's action. And what I mean by that is that it might be that the government is oftentimes pushing on an open, right? Companies or their leaders might very well prefer to act in the way that these new initiatives are pushing them in. So for example, Mark Zuckerberg really seems to believe in this sort of, I want masculine energy at Meta, I'm a UFC fighter, all sorts of strange stuff, right? And so that isn't necessarily an act that he's putting on in response to pressure from others or pressure from the Trump administration. It may just be that he now feels free to indulge those preferences or those aspects of his personality. So it's not obvious that it's external pressure. One thing I also do want to acknowledge, though, about this particular period is that a lot of the sort of internal track or the internal avenues for change do seem to be getting eroded or actively sabotaged during this period. So if the government is sort of eliminating shareholder proposal mechanisms or reducing the quality or quantity of disclosure, or if we're seeing major shifts from Delaware, which imposes some at least minimal level of accountability of corporate leaders to other states that are not imposing that level of accountability, we might see a very profound change in the whole internal track for achieving change. And the result might be corporate leaders that are less accountable to shareholders or to other stakeholders and more answerable to political officials. And that could really damage the dynamic.
So we're in 2026, and I want to hear you both on the affirmative case in the current environment about corporate activism. And so, Aneil, one of the core theses of Stark Choice is that internal reform, internal corporate action, as you call it, and external regulations are complements, that same political conditions that make it impossible leave sometimes the channel open. We've seen #MeToo, the Congress pipeline. We saw the Juneteenth pipeline. So do these pipelines still exist to some extent? Do we have to wait until the midterms? Do we have to wait until 2028 and see who's the winner of the presidential election?
Yeah, so the main thesis of Stark Choices was really that efforts to sort of push corporations to do better in various ways don't necessarily come at the expense of efforts to push the government to do better, right? So pushing companies to do better on climate change doesn't necessarily foreclose or take resources away or crowd out external regulations, government regulations that would push companies to do better on climate change. Now, the paper tries to work through a bunch of different reasons why that might be the case, but one is precisely the one that you identified, that there's a complementarity between corporate efforts and governmental efforts. There are various dynamics that may cause each to make the other more likely. And there's some evidence that that still continues to be the case, right? So one, and it's this kind of a virtuous feedback loop. The Biden administration very consciously tried to direct green investment into red states, right? So through the Inflation Reduction Act and through other mechanisms, they were really trying to encourage green projects in red states and red districts. And as a result, they crowded in private investment. Corporations started to invest in these facilities. And as a result, we now have this sort of ecosystem of clean energy companies and other kinds of companies in red states. And because of that, it's actually been quite difficult for the Trump administration to fully reverse course. So they oftentimes tout how the Department of Energy is pulling back all this green new scam financing, right? But oftentimes they're leaving financing in place precisely because you change the political economy around it, right? So we see government acting, we see corporations responding, and that corporate response constrains or shapes the government response going forward in a kind of virtuous cycle of investment. We might also notice that there have been relatively sparse but real acts of corporate resistance in various areas that have oftentimes triggered a constructive public debate. So thinking about Anthropic, for example, and their refusal to engage with the Defense Department on the Defense Department's preferred terms. Right? And that prompted a real conversation in public. Are these AI tools really safe for use in these particular contexts? Do we need more guardrails or not? We can see corporations kind of leading the conversation in a particular direction. Anthropic has also been saying we should have more regulation of AI. These tools are getting pretty dangerous. We can make an argument that this is largely an idea to sort of crowd out competitors or box out competitors, but there's also potentially something valuable to that conversation. The final point I would make, though, is that the complementarity can work in either direction, right? So it's entirely possible that corporations cooperating with the Trump administration has increased the efficacy of the Trump administration's efforts, right? And that's complementarity too. It might not be complementary in the direction that you or I would favor, right? It might be moving in the opposite direction, but it is a real complementarity. Each of them is making the other more powerful and enabling the other to do more important things.
Thank you. Tom, Capitalist and the Activist offers something in addition, a framework for how corporations and activists should engage each other, not just a structural account of why they can. What are the conditions under which corporate activism produces durable change rather than commitments that reverse at the first sign of pressure?
I think meaningful, durable action really works best and arises when there's a good alignment among the interests of business, politics, and society, and where the efforts of one segment amplifies the efforts of the other. So it creates this positive flywheel effect. Neil had mentioned sort of like a virtuous cycle. I think that's when it works best, when there's a good alignment of interests. The alignment need not be perfect, but when there's a good alignment, there's sort of this cross-pollination and this cross-amplification that makes the commitments more lasting and more durable. What you want is for some seeds to be planted that then over time can grow and evolve into something that's lasting and meaningful. So I think that's sort of one critical condition. Beyond that, I think foundationally, what is really helpful in addressing some of these tough challenges on issues like immigration or climate change is a simple recognition that business enterprises, activist enterprises are ultimately human enterprises. So they're going to reflect all the contradictions and complexities that human beings possess. It's going to be a mixed bag. Not every business, not every activist organization is going to be perfect. They're not all going to be good, and they're not all going to be bad. But nevertheless, you can work together to try to address and make some meaningful difference on some of these issues. I think too often in this day and age, a lot of progress and partnership is sacrificed as a result of some arbitrary notion of purity and perfection. And I think a simple recognition of sort of the complexity of the people behind these efforts is really constructive.
Thank you. I want to move on to the legitimacy critique, right? So many authors that have looked into the space have challenged the fact that corporate executives are not elected representatives. And so there's these legitimacy gap that they see in this space. Does corporate activism have a legitimacy problem that the current moment has exposed? And is the answer more politics or better corporate governance or some combination? Tom, what do you think?
I'm not sure it's a legitimacy problem. I would see it more as an expectations problem. I think it's understandable for people to see in an age where politics can seem so dysfunctional that the solutions lie in the private sector, that we want business to play a bigger role in solving some of the challenges confronting society. But the fact of the matter is that some of the challenges facing society are too large and too complicated for business to address on their own. To be sure, business should and can play an important role in helping to address these challenges. But in a democratic society, there's simply no substitute for good government. And no matter how well-intentioned or how well-resourced the private sector can be, it's simply inadequate to address a lot of these challenges.
And Aneil, Stock Choices was, as you said before, a little optimistic about the capacity of internal corporate reform to make external reform more likely. Where are we now on that, given the last couple of years?
I would acknowledge again, I am more pessimistic than I had been in the past. But I think I'd echo some of the points that Tom was making about the nature of human institutions and the expectations that we're placing on corporations. The ordinary political system elevated Donald Trump to the presidency. It elected Republicans to both houses of Congress. It has put 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court. To sort of expect that corporate governance is somehow going to drive society in the exact opposite direction is simply an unrealistic expectation. There's no way that could happen. Even assuming that that's the right thing to do, right? It's not necessarily obvious from a democratic legitimacy standpoint that we should be doing that. And so we shouldn't necessarily have that expectation of corporate America, and their failure to do that isn't necessarily an indictment of the overall process. And I think also to the extent that we are seeing corporations working with administration priorities, it again does suggest that there is some room for a constructive or cooperative relationship between government and sector in moving society in a positive direction. We just need to make sure that we as a society are selecting that positive direction and creating an environment in which that happens.
Great, thank you. So I want to end with some forward-looking question. So in the book, I was finishing it up a year and change ago. Corporate governing, as I call it, may be over or may be dormant for the time being, or it's maybe expecting the next wave. Conditions that produced it, political paralysis, intense stakeholder pressure, ESG engagement. could return or something structurally different could take their place. We don't know, right? What do you think? Will corporate social activism come back? And if it does, should it look different than what we saw the decade that just ended? Tom, what do you think?
I don't think it went away. I think it might not be moving as swiftly or as smoothly as some folks want it to be, but I don't think it ever went away. Businesses operate in society, and they're going to reflect and react to the shifting, changing attitudes about politics, about norms, and different priorities facing their communities. So businesses are going to be socially active because they don't operate in a vacuum, whether it's on issues of civil rights and gender equity or on issues of international trade and tax policy. I also think it's really important for people to see social issues more broadly, to include issues of economics, regulation, and tax policy, because those issues touch on the social fabrics of most people's daily lives.
Thank you. Aneil?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more hesitant and a little bit more skeptical. So I guess I haven't necessarily seen a lot of evidence of corporations sort of pushing in a helpful direction that's different from what the government would want. Oftentimes, even in contexts where you might expect them to do it because of their own personal economic stakes. So pushing back on tariffs, for example. That was a situation where you'd sort of expect corporate Americas to kind of gear up and push for change, but it was largely left to litigation by relatively small firms, oftentimes quite exposed firms, to do it. Because of the recent behavior of corporations and because of their reaction to the current environment, I think it's going to be a lot harder for customers or for workers to really embrace any activism going forward as being a real statement of principle that they're going to invest in or believe in. Right? Before, when you saw companies acting on equality or acting on various issues, you might think to yourself, well, this is sincere. This is something I can believe in. I'm going to make a commitment to this company as a result. I think if we suddenly see companies swinging back towards that, it's going to be a lot harder to take it seriously. I also worry on a more fundamental level whether our largest corporations have sacrificed or damaged the kind of social license to operate. And you oftentimes see Satya Nadella and other leaders, especially in the tech sector, talk about this. There's just been a profound loss of legitimacy. There's a sense amongst many Americans that corporate America is not acting in their interests or is openly hostile to their interests. And so, again, I think it would be very hard for them to pivot again and to say, actually, no, we're principled. We're trying to do things for equity. We're trying to do things on climate change. And going forward, we're going to be really good. And then to expect some level of investment from people. And that changes the cost-benefit analysis for them. Corporations might also really worry about the next Republican administration. So you can imagine after Donald Trump leaves office, we'll have maybe a Democratic administration and the companies try to switch back, right? But the extent of the switchback will also be disciplined to some extent by fears of what the next Republican administration is going to do. Right. So even if they want to embrace, say, DEI priorities, they might say to themselves, well, the last Republican administration demonstrated that doing that makes us really, really at risk of legal liability. And so we're just not going to do it. And so I am quite concerned about whether this dynamic is going to really succeed going forward because the fundamental cost benefit has changed.
And maybe what Tom just suggested a second ago is the way to go in that. If you want to rebuild some credibility, given the deficit of credibility of big corporate America, big tech, is you may want to tackle the economic issues first, which seem to be at the top of any voters' attention right now, and maybe readdress DEI when there's a space for that, or maybe just like have politicians fix it, because if we're all outraged by the reversal of corporate America, then there might be like a pathway for politics to actually intervene and set what are the principles, what are the rules we want in society, and not just rely on single atomistic corporate entities, right, to do that for us. So last question to both of you. If you were advising a corporation that generally wanted to act on socioeconomic issues in a durable way, and not as a PR exercise, not as a response to investor pressure, but as a real governance commitment, what would you actually tell them to do?
Probably two things. One is try to get them to see any efforts in a way that is framed as better is good. It might not be best, but it's good. So, for example, if you can't sort of get federal legislation to expand parental benefits, for instance, but you could do it within your own company, you should do it. And then other peers and competitors might follow along, right? Because better is good. It might not be best, but it's good and it's a start. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would advise them to do is to focus on the long-term prosperity of their business. Figure out what they value, focus their efforts and their energy on it. Try to block out the short-term noise from the marketplace, from politicians, and from the media. I think for many businesses, if you focus on the long-term prosperity of your enterprise, you're likely to end up doing what's right by your shareholders, your employees, your customers, and your community. It's really hard to have a sustainably successful business if you are continually disappointing or offending your shareholders, your employees, your customers, and your community. And I think that's something that most businesses and business executives can understand.
Aneil?
I think I'd start by just seconding everything that Tom has said. That's all really excellent advice. The one thing maybe I'll add is to just do it. Right? You want to do something, go do it. File the lawsuit, litigate the lawsuit, make the investment, make the change, continue speaking out. Just go out and do the things that you're thinking about doing. One interesting thing about the current moment is that there is a sort of cost that comes from doing things right now, right? Politicians will come after you, the government might target you, and that is a real cost. But it also increases your credibility when you do these things. Before, people might have said, you're only acting like you care about these issues because you're trying to win over people. This isn't a principled commitment. This isn't something that we should believe in. If you do it now, it really is a principled commitment, or at least it reads as a principled commitment, especially at a time when a lot of customers, a lot of workers are really hungry for that kind of principled commitment. And so I would suggest that this is the right moment to make that kind of long-term investment in your positioning and the way that you have a relationship with your employees and your customers going forward. And so I'd encourage companies to just go off and do that right now, as opposed to waiting for the long term.
Yeah, and this was coming out of during the Veronica Rubin Martinez episode, where it's kind of new that you're so afraid of the government, right? You know, if you're a large corporation, you normally are in the business litigating with the government because regulatory overreach, right? Agency overreach, and that's what happens normally. This time around, businesses caved very fast and caught everyone off guard. Let's say the DEI reversal was and the executive orders. But at the same time, if you look at it, not from a short-term perspective, as Tom was mentioning, but you just like have to expand it, then you sort of reorganize and have your legal team clear as to what your positions were, because you don't wake up just one day and figure out, oh my goodness, I just realized that all my compliance programs were off because I didn't really know what the law was. It was clearly absurd, right? So yeah, we will probably see more of this. And I would add that better transparency about what they are doing, what they were doing is what corporations are doing, what corporations are going to be doing is going to be helpful in the future to have your communications team also not just throw out the new on a bandwagon new slogans, but actually explain why you're doing this, why this is important to your various stakeholders, and why you believe in the path you've taken. Tom Lin, Aneil Kovvali, thank you so much for a conversation that clarified a lot of things, complicated a lot of things, but showed how much nuance can be and how complex these things are, but also how much there is to learn looking at corporations and politics in the future. So 2024 was not the end of it. We're still in it, and we'll see where we'll end up in a few years from now. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so links to Tom's and Aneil's work are going to be in the show notes. My book, Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, is published by Cambridge University Press. This is Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. Thank you for listening.